Hi, I'm here today with Dr. Kirk James, clinical professor at New York University Silver School of Social Work, advocate, and also creator of MICE, which stands for Mass Incarceration Conversation Series.
Yeah.
Dr. James, thanks for being here
Thank
today,
you.
and thank
Thank
you for
you.
the work that you're
Absolutely.
doing. Just to kind of get started
Yeah.
and get our audience familiar with this work and why we're here. What is Mike's, and where was it created for you?
Yeah, thank you. So I think maybe I would like to take a step back. So Mike's is the Mass Incarceration Conversation Series, and Mike's is the acronym, right? So Mike's is very much connected to who I am as a person. So I think it would be really good to explain that a little bit.
Okay.
I recently had a conversation with someone, and they said, imagine the happiest moment in your life, right? And what that energy felt like. And I actually had to sit for a few minutes to actually think about, wow, what has been the happiest moment in my life, right? And that may sound weird for people considering maybe who I am and my positionality, right? But there is a lot more to me than a clinical assistant professor at NYU, right? So I think Mike's is important to me because my experience as a black man in this world has been historically traumatic, right? I go back and I look at, I was born to a mother that had me at 16 years old. And as someone that does work around attachment, that does work around relational theory, I ask myself, what does that mean to me, right? What did that mean to my future relationships, right? When you think about attachment theory, et cetera, right? And what did that mean to my development? What did that mean to the trajectory that I would end up taking? So 16 years old, a mother, again, having, a woman having a child as a child. Being raised in a society that was inherently violent, right? Not only personal violence, right, but societal violence. And a lot of that was political violence, right? So witnessing extreme violence as a young kid. I was raised in Jamaica. So I think about like 1980 and 1981, the violence, of the election, et cetera, right? Which would ultimately force my family to migrate in 1986 to America. So then, the trauma of migration, right? Why do people migrate? Why do people leave their homes? What's that impact? That is something that for so long that I've just normalized in my life. Which would ultimately lead at 18 years old to me being incarcerated, right? So all these things, and obviously I'm skipping some extent, but all these things are directly connected, right? And I think for me in sharing my story and for even doing Mike's, right, my impetus is to create a narrative around these experiences, right? No one is their worst decision, right? Everyone got to that point from a series of events that would ultimately lead them to that. So as someone who went to prison at 18, right, 40 of us in the back of a bus, right, and have had that experience that Wu-Tang Clan speaks about, right, and have had that experience with the criminal justice system, right. My first offer at 18 years old with the criminal justice system was 40 years to life, right, wow. 40 years to life. And I remember ultimately saying to my legal aid attorney, right, this man that has a caseload of 300 people, that every time he meets me, it's as if it's a first time, right? Because there's no way for him to remember the 300 people that's on his caseload. I remember saying to him, I was like, are you sure you're looking at the right, case? And this was 1994, right? And he says to me, he says, selling drugs in New York City is just as bad as murder, right, if not worse. So at the time, I was charged with 8 A1 felonies, right, which are the equivalent of 8 murders for the possession of 2 to 4 ounces of cocaine. And it was a conspiracy case. It was a case that I was not even directly involved in. I was entrapped, right, but that's a story within itself. But my experience within the justice system, right, I'm not even saying the criminal justice system, my experience within the justice system was a eye-opener for myself and my family, right? And I realized that ultimately, later on, I'd realize that I'm not an aberration, right? This isn't something that has solely happened to me, but this has been the experience of the majority, 1 in 3 black men, specifically in America, right? And so even the Wu-Tang verse that I just quoted, right, going back and looking at my time of coming of age in the 1990s, right, most of the music was speaking about mass incarceration. We just spoke about Nas's One Love, right? Here's Nas, writing a letter to his friend that is incarcerated, right? Wu-Tang Clan's Cream, right? 40 of us in the back of a bus, life as a shorty shouldn't be so rough, right? We're talking about, young men going back and forth to prison, facing trial, right? And, the experiences of living in this system. So Mike's, again, to me, it's deeply personal. It's my life. It's not just, again, something that isn't, educational excursion for me. I feel that the history of America has been essentially set up to persecute black men, right? And as a profession, social work that has a organizing value of social justice, it was very important for me to create this project to create further education around this issue.
Wow, and just in that explanation alone, I can not only identify personally, but I'm sure that any of our audience members who sees this will completely identify. And one of the things I want to ask you, you initially mentioned how you began to see this play out in your own life, correct? At what point was there a transition for you that you began to see a broader picture on what was happening in the lives of young black men and brown men in this country? What was that like, and what was that moment like for you, and what steps did you make in regards to that perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So there are maybe a few periods, right? So I didn't say in the first segment that I actually ended up going to prison, right? So I ended up going to prison for 9 years, right, as a first-time offender. And the judge told me that he was doing me a favor, sentencing me to 7 years to life as a first-time offender. And throughout that experience, many things happened. And one of the things that happened that was really significant was because I was born in Jamaica, I also had now an order of deportation, right? So they tried to deport me. So I remember one day I was going back and forth to court. And I, thankfully won that case. So obviously I'm not deported. I'm here today, right? And even that's another conversation, the intersection of like immigration within the constructs of the criminal justice system, right? So I wouldn't be deported, but I was coming back from court one day with a young man. And by that time, I'd been in prison maybe 7 years, right? So I was now like maybe 25. And I remember speaking to this young man. This young man was like maybe 17 years old, 16 years old. He had just come upstate. And in many ways, his disposition was very much like mine. He was from Queens. So I kind of identified with this young man. And I remember having a conversation with him. And I'm trying to implant like all the knowledge that I'd gained from this experience to help him to navigate in healthier ways, right? And I remember him looking at me and saying, thank you so much. But he's like, I'm not going home for a long time, man. And he begun to tell me that he had 35 years. This young man that was 17 years old had 35 years to life, right? And it was in that moment, I really paused and really took notice to the destruction that was happening around me, right? Because even though I was in a space that was, saw many young men, many men with their lives destroyed by this system, I'd been so engrossed in my own survival that I didn't actually pause to see the destruction happening around me. So that was a moment I got outside of myself and was like, wow, I've even to this day telling this story, it's still something that is very emotional for me, because I often think about this man is probably still in prison, right? He's still in prison somewhere, not even halfway through his sentence, right? So that was one. And when I got out of prison, right, I didn't know still what this was, right? I didn't know what this was. I still felt that, this was an experience that was still directly related to me. And as I got involved with social work, one of the things I realized was like, wow, we're not talking about this issue, right? Like I became a social worker because I believed in social justice, right? I knew that I wanted to really create a better world, and I wanted to be a part of that, right? I wanted to see a better world, and I wanted to be a part of that. And I realized we weren't talking around this issue. There weren't any conversations around this issue. So as I began to do my own research, right, this was even like before the new Jim Crow, right, as I began to do my own research and started to come to a lot of those conclusions that, you know, the new Jim Crow spoke about, right? I read George Jackson while I was incarcerated, and George Jackson speaks about the intentionality of these systems, right, realizing that slavery never ended, right? So the 13th Amendment, we all know about the 13th Amendment, right? If you don't, you know, see 13, see Michelle Alexander, read Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, right? There's so much material out there right now to show, right, how slavery essentially transitioned, right? So we went from, you know, slavery to the 13th Amendment, then we went to, you know, black codes, right, laws that essentially criminalized blackness, right? You then had ideologies to support black criminality, right? And then you develop convict leasing system, right? So now, because this is, again, you know, like an economic system, right? Slavery was an economic system. So then you then essentially, once we're convicted, because we're always convicted, right? Even to this day, right? 90% of people in the criminal justice system end up ultimately taking pleas, right? Because it's really insurmountable. So once we're convicted, then we're leased out to the plantation. So we have convict leasing system. Fast forward 100 years, you have the same new system. You have, you know, the war on drugs, right? Again, war on black people, right? And you have the birth of maybe the second phase of mass incarceration. So as I began to study these things and saw the intentionality of it, I was really like, wow, right? This is very intentional, right? These aren't like mistakes, right? The justice system, you know, has been designed with the intention to suppress and to control, you know, people of color in the United States.
One of the things, and I don't want to divert too much from the conversation, but you did speak on this idea of the black codes and these various laws that criminalize the blackness, and these individuals were sent back to these plantations. Do you see that reflective in today's criminal justice system when you think of what that's kind of been deemed a criminal industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, where corporations are involved in using the slave labor or free labor within our criminal justice system that impacts the same idea of economic
exploitation and suppression. Yeah, absolutely. It's the same system, right? And I think, again, so much of what I want to do with Mike's, right, is to create awareness around the history of these issues, as we're often responding to these things like they're the first time, right? Or even when we speak about, you and I just had a conversation earlier where I told you my sensitivity to the word reform, right?
Yeah.
Because like the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? And I think in that awareness, then we have a responsibility to imagine something new. And this is what I envision of Mike's. I imagine, you know, bringing social workers who are at the intersection of all these issues, bringing policymakers, bringing people impacted, right, to really come together and have conversations around what could a new system look like. I feel reform, really honestly, reform is a way to minimize the harm of these systems, right? There's no way that we would talk about reform in slavery, so I don't think that we should talk about reform in mass incarceration, right? Mass incarceration is actually a euphemism, you know, a word that sounds good, because it's easier for us to say mass incarceration than to say slavery in 2018.
Wow, and one of the other areas I think it would be a disservice if we do not hit on this idea of trauma through these experiences. Earlier we were talking, and it was mentioned that, you know, a lot of the research and data that we speak on, they talk about the trauma that begins or happens once a person is incarcerated in the system, and we build these techniques and methods on how to deal with that. How do you perceive that when you, as having a lived experience, academic experience, advocacy, professional experience, how do you perceive this idea, this notion of trauma being inflicted on or caused by the criminal justice system?
Ooh, so breathe.
breathe.
So I think the first thing is this, like, let's talk about trauma, right? Our understanding of trauma comes from war, right? War. So you think specifically around World War One, World War Two, right? We started to research the impact of these experiences, right? What was the impact of people, men, being exposed to significant amount of violence in short periods, right? Because we started to see that they were not the same, right? Like the people, our husbands, our fathers, you know, when they came back from war, they were not the same people. We started to see high rates of alcoholism, right? High rates of violence, right? A lot of things that are very akin to mass incarceration or people who have been impacted by that system, right? But again, ground this conversation in that our understanding of trauma comes from war. So when we think about, again, the experiences of people who are impacted by the criminal justice system, right, which are often black and brown men, right, women are the fastest growing, women of color are the fastest growing prison population. But historically, these systems have impacted black and brown men more than anyone else, right? 1 in 3 men, black men, have been somehow impacted by the criminal justice system, right? So again, when we think about trauma, right, it didn't just start there, right? It started when, it started during colonialism, right? It started during chattel slavery, right? It started on the plantations when we were raped, when we were exploited, when we were molested, you know, all those things, right? It started when we were quote unquote released from slavery and had nowhere to go and had to steal to feed our children, right? And had to beg and borrow, right? And the humiliation and just the constant assault that has been America for people of color, right? So it just didn't start there, right? Like most of the people who've been involved with these systems can tell you about the immense trauma that they experienced before these systems, right? So that's the first thing. When I think about trauma, I don't think about it starting there. I have a good friend who often talks about, like for me, when I think about trauma, I think about, you know, the women who jumped off the slave ships with their children rather than and live this experience, right? And there's even this great study, right, ACEs study that looked at the impact of children who would experience like harm, right? And it showed that, you know, children who were subjected to trauma, harm at a young age, oftentimes had an impact throughout their lives. Imagine that, right? So children who one experience of harm would impact you throughout your life. So it's impossible for us to even begin to imagine the impact of slavery, imagine the impact of capitalism, imagine the impact of colonialism, imagine the impact of Jim Crow, imagine the impact of, you know, anti-blackness in every which way, right? And try to imagine in prisons, right? Just try to imagine what that impact is. So I think when I think about trauma, right, I think about trauma as, you know, just pervasive, right? Just like, and it's not post. It's never been post, right? So like when we talk about veterans coming home from war, it's always PTSD, right? Because they're no longer at war. The war has never ended, you know? So it's really, it's such a ripe conversation for us to have, right? Because I think it's integral. If we are going to be the instruments of our liberation, because the system's not going to liberate us, right? So if we're going to be the instruments of our liberation, people who care about justice, people who, you know, shout to Glenn, people closest to the problem, closest to the solution, right? Then it's important for us to emphasize healing, right? To really understand that we need to create mechanisms of healing. For social workers that are doing work around these issues, you have to understand how important it is to utilize a trauma perspective, right? Because there's nobody that's not been impacted within this larger system, right? So it's so important for us to, you know, simultaneously thinking about, you know, decolonizing these systems, right? But also like really paying attention to our own healing, you know, within these systems as well.
And just on that, I think it was recently Jay-Z made mention that he began to seek a type of therapy for himself, not on just to the personal, just on in regards to his very existence as a human being. And I made that point specifically. Do you think that the stigma around mental health and trauma that impacts
you're rocking.
Communities of color and men of color, how is that stigma impacting the work and your
Absolutely.
perspective and views?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is this, right? One of my young comrades, Josh, he said something really powerful yesterday, right, in a conversation. He says, first of all, when you think about the construct of masculinity, right? I mean, it's already toxic, right? We already know masculinity is toxic, right? But then when you think about black masculinity, it's like 10 times more toxic, right? Because first of all, we are taught to suppress our emotions. Right, we're taught to suppress our emotions. We're taught never to cry, and we're taught never to ask for help. Right, so
Exactly.
yeah. So then,
Exactly.
what
Hell
happens?
yours. Hell yours.
So what happens then? Like, what happens with all this hurt and pain inside me? Right, it just continues to fester till it ultimately destroys me. Right, and then I think even when we think about how we've responded to trauma, right? We've responded to trauma through violence, through aggression, through substance use, right? Like no one connects like substance use to. I had a really good friend who had been arrested over 50 times, and he said to me once, he said, you know what it was? Like they kept putting me in treatment programs, but it wasn't the drugs, it was the trauma. Right. So, shout out to Jay-Z, because so many of us, men of color, have to show up more vulnerably to say that, there's a different way, right? Like it's okay to feel afraid. It's okay to feel lonely. It's okay to feel depressed. It's okay to feel sad, right? It's okay to feel isolated, right? And it's when we're able, Baldwin says this really great thing. He says, we can't heal what we don't reveal, right? And Jay-Z copies that to some extent, right? But it's like, that's it, right? Like you can't heal what we don't reveal. And for so long, we have not had the space, right? The space, right? To be able to say how these systems have created harm for us. So I think we're in a beautiful time to really destroy what we perceive to be masculinity, right? And really create something new. And I think a big part of doing that is this, right? To be able to show up with other men, and talk about it, right? And talk about it vulnerably and talk about it for real, right? But, again, because we have an audience in mind for this, for folks that are doing this work, right? It's so important that you show up and you allow safe space, right? Like maybe safe space, brave space, whatever we want to call it, right? But that we cultivate spaces that afford people to, share on a human level, right?
Well, Dr. James, I'm sure that our audience has enough that they can chew on for another week. We want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing in regards to social justice. And again, we're going to not go so much with criminal justice reform, but in social justice and equality throughout the country, and in your work and in those spaces that you provide. We're going to ask you to join us next time on Mike's, and that's Mass Incarceration Conversation Series. And I was telling Dr. James, I hope we could have ran Nas as one mic, but the next time. So stay tuned, and we look forward to hearing from you and coming to this space again.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peace.